Hello and welcome to my workshop. So today we're going to be building a VW thing. I just recently finished a VW thing truck, but this is going to be the regular VW thing, and it's going to go onto my old comp chassis. Alright, so let's get started. I recently finished up a VW thing truck. When I was making that body, I realized that I could also make the regular VW thing with just a few extra molds. I didn't have a real reason to make one at the time, but I figured why not? Turns out I fell in love with this body, since this one's going to be mine. Most of the time the floor pans are very flat. However, in this case they transition several times to form the area for the rear seat and the storage cargo area. I 3D printed the rear louver section and just needed to cut out a hole to glue in the print from behind. I had most of the body figured out from just recently finishing the truck. The panels were sanded back and filler pieces added on the joints before gluing them together. With the body panels taking shape, I can glue in the rear section and make minor adjustments. The rear section was made by 3D printing a piece for the center, and then carving from wood the outer pieces. I always try to think through the best method, and sometimes that involves mixed media. I didn't do it in this body, but the rear engine cover is made in the way that it can be hinged. This could allow for an engine to be displayed, or for it to be used as an access area for a battery. However, the biggest reason is to make the seam look more realistic. It takes a little bit of sanding before the engine cover can be glued into place. This is done after applying the dolphin glaze to the transitions between the side and the rear panel. The dolphin glaze is an AB filler, much like Bondo, but has a much better finish and it self-levels. The rear fenders, which were made extra wide for the truck, can be cut back to match up with the papered in rear section. This is pretty simple due to the straight panels on the thing. The front fenders are a little more complicated, but the same basic strategy is used. For these fenders, I mark the front and back using the paper template. Painter's tape is then stretched between the 2 points and a line is drawn on the part. A little trimming and sanding and it's ready to be glued in place. The front windscreen is a laminated piece made up of different thicknesses of styrene sheet. The innermost layer is cut a little large on the inside to form a frame to clear the windscreen to be glued in later. I also add a few decorative pieces to the sides, which make it look more like the real one. Once it is glued together, the edges are sanded back and any small amounts of filler is added. This is important since no amount of careful measuring, cutting, or gluing will give you a clean edge as sanding the part once it's one piece. An angle is cut on the bottom, and the windscreen is glued to the body. With most of the exterior taken care of, I switched to the rear seats. The front seats are the same as the truck, but I needed to make seat molds for the rear. The mold are not very over complex, since the back seat of the thing closely resembles a patio couch cushions. There's an extremely thin base and 2 individual backrests. The seats are intended to be hinged, but for this I just chose to screw them in place. A thicker section of styrene was glued to the back of the seat and sanded back to match the angle of the seat supports before sinking M3 screws from underneath. The front seats were cut away from the mold, and the uprights got a back glued in place. After the top was sanded, it was glued to the seat base. The seat base gets a thick styrene shape glued along the inner edge. This gives a place for M2 hardware to be screwed in and hold the seat to the floor pan. It takes a few measurements to get the placement for the front seats and driveline tunnel. The tunnel isn't as big as modern cars since the engine was in the back. It does offer a place where a transfer case, carefully mounted, can protrude up into it though. This will allow me to keep a full interior and get the body as low as possible on the chassis. The doors for this were 3D printed, but I made a mold for the structure around the door. Since the truck only used 2 doors, I had to make a new one for the 4-door. I thought about just making an extension piece for the rear, or grafting 2 of them together after being vacuum formed, but decided a new mold would be the easiest. The rear gets very close to the seat transition, which makes the piece very thin. This is not a problem since the mold gets glued to a solid piece of MDF to raise it up off the vacuum table. This is key since tight transitions are near impossible right where the part meets the table. Once the heated styrene is formed over the mold, it can be roughly cut to shape. I use a pencil on the edge of my finger as a guide to draw cut lines all around the part. It takes a lot more trimming before the piece is ready to glue into place. The inner structure gives a spot where the door can be glued in place once painted. Speaking of painting, here is the dash and door getting a coat of red paint. The body has been filled and sanded back a few times and is now ready for some 2-in-1 primer. This is a sandable primer which also does a good job of filling minor scratches. It takes a day or two to fully dry, but once there, it can be wet sanded back. Small pieces like the door hinges can be added at this point. The body can now receive a thin coat of red. This gives me enough sheen and color to see any final scratches that need to be repaired. The seats in the truck use a cotton sheet infused onto printer paper. For the truck, I chose a Hawaiian shirt print to go with the beach theme. For this, I thought more of a Brady Bunch 70s vibe would be best. A picture of some wallpaper was used to print the pattern on the cotton material before cutting it to shape. The edges fray really bad on this material, but a thin coat of liquid stitch along the edge keeps things in check. In the past, I used a stick glue for fixing the fabric, but switched to spray-on contact adhesive. Instead of spraying both pieces, I just spray a heavy coat on the fabric. This is then placed on the seat while still wet. The cloth will allow the glue to dry properly and should make a permanent bond. Black flocking is glued into the interior after loads of masking. The headlights get glued in next. Once again, I am using RC 4-wheel drive Mojave round lenses. They are placed inside a pair of custom designed and 3D printed housings. The back side is an aluminum funnel cut down and drilled out for a 5mm LED. The taillights are printed out in a clear resin and carefully painted amber and red. After all is dry, the edge is painted black to represent the gasket material. When I made the windscreen, it was laminated with styrene sheets. The inner sheet was cut so that it created a recessed area where the clear piece of plastic can be glued in place. It's pretty easy cutting this one to shape, since it's just mostly a rectangle. The last few details are sorted, such as door handles, inside and out, along with all the details on the steering column. Most of these are just painted with a silver paint from Vallejo. The doors are glued in place once completed. On the first thing, I painted the dash pad by hand, but did not apply any tape. This time, I made it a little easier on myself by placing down a layer of tape on top and bottom before applying a matte black. The seats are screwed into place. I just take a pick to stick through the hole so it can be aligned easier. With the seats all installed, Woody gets to take his rightful place behind the steering wheel. When doing my last minute checks, I realized the rear latch was not printed. This was due to the fact that I forgot to design it. So I went to Fusion 360 and made one before printing on my Anycubic resin printer. This VW thing has turned out great, and I am super excited to see it finished. I still have a lot to sort out with the chassis and running gear, but that will have to wait until next time. Until then, I'll see you on the rocks.